The old soldier exhaled slowly, staring at the silent stars beyond the viewport. War had followed him across planets, through burning atmospheres, across graveyards of ships that would never be found. He had seen men die with prayers on their lips and others screaming for their mothers. But none of it, had prepared him for the revenants. You think you know war? His voice was hoarse, rough with the weight of memories. You don't. Not like we've seen it. Across from him, Captain Elias Rourke sat rigid, his fingers interlocked atop the steel briefing table. He had the bearing of a man unaccustomed to failure. But today, failure was the only thing left on the board. The other officers, barely a dozen now where once there had been hundreds, exchanged uneasy glances. The room smelled of old sweat and burnt coffee, the air thick with the unspoken. General Castro Voss, the highest-ranking officer still breathing after the massacre at Orion's wake, leaned forward, her scarred knuckles tapping against the metal table. "We don't have time for ghosts, Sergeant Major," she said, her voice like ground glass. "If you have something to say, say it." The old soldier's gaze flicked to her. Voss was the kind of leader who held broken lines together with sheer will, but wouldn't save them. Not this time. "You think this is just another war." His tone was flat, but something in it made even the younger officers stiffen. "You think, because we've fought colony skirmishes, because we put down rebellions, because we've faced pirates and rogue AI, that we understand what's out there." He shook his head. "We don't." The silence was palpable. Beyond the cold walls of the station, the shattered wreckage of the UTS Resolute drifted like a corpse in the black, its hull still burning. They had thought the revenants could be fought like any other enemy. They had been wrong. Rourke cleared his throat, trying to reclaim some control over the conversation. "Tell us what we're dealing with, then." The old soldier leaned forward, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "They don't fight like us. They don't think like us. And they don't leave survivors unless they want us to see something." He gestured toward the dimly lit hologram above the table. A frozen feed from Orion's Wake's last transmission. A world burning. But it wasn't just fire. The footage showed something wrong. Buildings twisting, warping as if time itself had fractured. Soldiers running, screaming, their weapons turning to dust in their hands. And the shadows moving. Not men, not machines, but something in between. Castro Voss studied the image, her jaw tightening. "We've seen this footage," she said. "What we need are facts. How do they fight? What do they want?" The old soldier's laugh was low, humorless. "Want?" He ran a calloused hand over his face. "You're thinking too human. They don't want. They consume. They rewrite. We went into Orion's Wake thinking we'd find an enemy fleet. Instead, we found the bones of a city still screaming." Rourke shifted uncomfortably. "We still don't know if it was some kind of weapon." "It wasn't a weapon," the soldier interrupted. "It was, that's how they kill. They don't just burn cities, Captain. They unmake them." A young lieutenant at the end of the table, pale-faced and wide-eyed, swallowed hard. "Then why haven't they attacked Earth? If they're so powerful..." "They don't need to," Voss answered before the old soldier could. Her voice had the edge of someone who had already worked out the nightmare on her own. "They've been testing us. Studying. Orion's Wake was the first step. Our response fleet was the second. And now, they know how we fight." The weight of her words settled over the room like a funeral shroud. "Then what do we do?" Rourke asked, and for the first time, there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Not defiance, not anger, fear. The old soldier exhaled, his gaze drifting back to the viewport, to the shattered remains of what had once been the pride of the UTD fleet. "We prepare." Voss stood, the chair scraping against the floor. "No," she said, her eyes burning with something cold and lethal. "We don't just prepare. We change the way we think, the way we fight. Because if we don't..." She let the words hang unfinished. She didn't need to say them. If they didn't, there wouldn't be anyone left to fight. The distress call from Orion's wake came in fragments, broken by static and something else, something that made even the hardened bridge officers shift uneasily. The audio was distorted, but the screams were unmistakable. A single phrase repeated between bursts of interference. "They are inside the walls." Captain Elias Rourke stood at the center of the UTS Valor's bridge, watching the garbled transmission loop for the fourth time. The colony's emergency beacon still pulsed in system, a lifeline thrown into the void, but there had been no further transmissions, no chatter, no automated reports. Just this. His second-in-command, Commander Hale, folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "Could be a pirate attack," she said, though the words lacked conviction. "Or a failed AI lockdown." "Pirates don't silence entire colonies," Rourke replied. "And AI malfunctions don't leave people screaming." The Valor was one of 12 ships in the task force sent to investigate, a show of force meant to remind any would-be aggressors that the United Terran Defense did not tolerate lawlessness. They had expected a crisis. They had not expected this. "Sir," one of the comm officers called out, hesitating. "I tried running diagnostics on the transmission. There's another layer underneath the audio." Rourke turned. "Explain." "It's not static," the officer continued, fingers flying across her console. "There's something encoded beneath the distress call, a kind of subharmonic signal. Playing it now," another officer confirmed, patching the sound through the bridge's speakers. The noise that followed was not human. It was a low, resonant hum, vibrating in the bones, pressing against the mind like a whisper just beyond comprehension. The bridge lights flickered. Hale flinched, shaking her head as if trying to dislodge something unseen. "Cut it." Rourke's order was sharp, and the sound died instantly. For a moment, the only thing that remained was silence, thick, unnatural silence. It took a moment for the crew to breathe again, to shake off whatever had settled in their skulls. "What in the hell was that?" Hale muttered, rubbing her temples. Rourke didn't answer. He turned toward the viewport, where Orion's wake loomed in the distance, a crescent of steel and glass against the gas giant it orbited. The colony was dark, too dark. No security lights, no atmospheric control beacons, just a dead city floating in the void. "Take us in," he ordered. Weapons hot. The fleet moved into formation, their warships cutting through the black like blades. The Valor scanners swept over the colony, searching for signs of life, broadcasting hails that went unanswered. The silence stretched. Then, a flicker. Contact. Came the call from Tactical. Movement on the surface. Rourke narrowed his eyes. The main display zoomed in, enhancing the grainy image of the colony's main thoroughfare. The building stood intact, untouched by fire or battle, yet something felt wrong. The proportions of the structure seemed slightly off, like the angles no longer adhered to human design. Shadows pooled in places that had no business holding darkness. And there, in the middle of the street, figures stood in stillness. Dozens of them, hundreds, motionless. Rourke leaned in, his stomach tightening. "Human?" "Unclear," the officer replied. "They aren't responding to comms." Zoom in. The image sharpened, and the bridge fell into stunned silence. The figures were human or had been. Their bodies were twisted wrong, like something had reached inside them and rearranged the pieces at will. Joints bent in unnatural directions, spines coiled like living wire. Some had no faces. Others had too many. And their skin, if it could still be called that, rippled with a faint metallic sheen. Then, as if sensing they were being watched, they all turned their heads in unison, looking directly at the drone's camera. Rourke's blood went cold. "Pull the fleet back. Now." The order had barely left his lips when the shadows moved. Not the people, the shadows. They slithered across the buildings like liquid, like something alive, and then they rose, coalescing into jagged shapes, half-formed limbs, gnashing mouths. The air itself distorted, bending in ways that defied physics. A warning klaxon blared. "Sir, something's coming." The transmission cut out in a burst of static. The drone was gone, and then the darkness struck. The first explosion rocked the fleet before the enemy even registered on their sensors. A pulse, like an invisible wave, slammed into the Valor, sending arcs of electricity across the consoles. Rourke caught himself against the command chair, barking orders. All ships, evasive maneuvers, fire at will. But there was nothing to fire at. No ships, no battle formations, just a void, swallowing them whole. And then they were inside. The Revenants didn't board ships like conventional enemies. They didn't fire missiles or exchange broadsides. They bypassed armor, ignored hull plating, and simply appeared where they wanted to be. One moment the bridge was filled with the tense hum of battle. The next, the lights dimmed and the air felt thick. Shapes flickered in the periphery. Not men, not machines, something else. Hale drew her sidearm, her breath sharp and ragged. "We need to get the hell out of here." "We can't," Rourke growled, wrenching the controls. Not yet. The fleet was falling apart. The UTS Resolute, one of their heaviest cruisers, folded in on itself as though crushed by an unseen force. Other ships fired blindly, their weapons lighting up the darkness but hitting nothing. Screams came over the comms. Not just voices, but something deeper, wrong layered, as if more than one throat spoke at once. Rourke made his decision. All ships, retreat to FTL coordinates. Fall back. Hale punched in the emergency jump sequence. The Valor shuddered, its engine struggling against whatever unnatural force had wrapped around them. Across the fleet, ships fought to escape. Some made it, others didn't. As the jump drive engaged, Rourke caught one last glimpse of Orion's wake. The figures in the streets were moving now, stepping forward in perfect, synchronized strides. The shadows around them pulsed, as if alive, as if feeding. Then the stars twisted, the ship lurched, and the fleet was gone. The Valor emerged into real space hours later, battered and broken, but alive. The silence on the bridge was heavy, punctuated only by the crackle of sparking wires and the labored breathing of the survivors. Hale was the first to speak. "What the hell did we just fight?" Rourke's grip tightened on the armrest of his chair. His voice was hollow. "We didn't fight," he said. "We survived." The war didn't start with a declaration. There were no terms, no demands, no negotiations. The Revenants did not recognize diplomacy, did not pause for treaties. When they struck, it was without warning, without pattern, and without mercy. Earth received the first real blow 3 weeks after Orion's wake. Not on its soil, not yet, but at Proxima Command, humanity's strongest military outpost beyond Sol. A fortress carved into the iron heart of Proxima B, meant to be a deterrent against any force foolish enough to challenge the united Terran defense. It had enough firepower to hold a fleet at bay for months. It lasted 6 hours. The transmissions began as static. Then came the whispers, garbled voices layered over each other, speaking in languages that did not exist. The station's AI malfunctioned within minutes, locking out command systems, opening airlocks at random. By the time the Revenants arrived, Proxima Command had already begun tearing itself apart. Survivors spoke of shadows spilling through bulkheads, of figures that were there one moment and gone the next. Entire squads turned on each other, driven mad by something unseen. The final message sent from the station came from Admiral Rains, a veteran of a dozen campaigns, a man who had once turned the tide of battle against the rogue AI insurrection at Io. His voice was calm, steady, even as the chaos consumed his station. "They are not invaders. They are not conquerors. We are not at war. We are being erased." And then Proxima Command was gone, a smoldering ruin left drifting in the void. On Earth, the response was immediate. The Terran Defense Council convened within the hour. Generals, admirals, politicians, Men and women who had spent their lives preparing for war, none of them ready for what had come. The Valor's crew, still recovering from their own encounter, had been recalled to fleet headquarters on Luna. They were not there to be briefed. They were there to be interrogated. Rourke sat in a stark, windowless chamber, the steel table between him and the panel of officers cold against his palms. Across from him, Admiral Soren, the highest-ranking officer in the fleet now that Rains was gone, studied him with tired eyes. "You fought them," Soren said, his voice quiet. "Tell me what you saw." Rourke met his gaze. "We didn't fight," he said. "We ran." Silence. Soren exhaled slowly, glancing down at the report on his tablet. "The fleet lost 34 ships in the past month. Another 12 have gone dark. We've recovered 1 crew. Yours. That means you're the only ones who know what we're up against." He leaned forward. "So tell me, Captain, what are we up against?" Rourke thought of Orion's wake, of Proxima, of shadows that moved when they shouldn't. He forced himself to breathe. "They don't fight like us," he said. "They don't think like us. They don't invade planets. They consume them. He hesitated, searching for the right words. "They make you doubt what's real." Soren's expression darkened. "Explain." Rourke clenched his fists. "They don't just kill. They alter. People, ships, cities. They turn what's ours into something theirs. They don't burn worlds, Admiral. They rewrite them." The room was silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Finally, Soren leaned back, his fingers steepled. "Then we have to hit them first." Rourke frowned. "With what?" Soren's lips pressed into a thin line. "We're mobilizing every fleet, every colony defense force, every black project that's been shelved for the last 50 years. Full wartime production. The UTD hasn't declared total war since the Titan Rebellion, but this is different. We don't have time for drawn-out conflicts. We either end this fast, or we lose everything." Hale, standing behind Rourke, folded her arms. "Admiral, with all due respect, we still don't know how to fight them." Soren nodded. "Then we find out." That night, Earth's sky filled with the fire of departing warships. Dreadnoughts, carriers, corvettes, an armada unlike anything humanity had ever assembled. But as Rourke stood on Luna's observation deck, watching the fleets form up, he couldn't shake the cold certainty in his gut. They were preparing for a war. But this wasn't a war. It was something worse. The fleet never made it to the front. Humanity's greatest armada. 15 dreadnoughts, 200 warships, thousands of fighter wings, burned before they ever reached their targets. It started at Waypoint 6, the designated rally point between Sol and the Proxima Line. The fleet had gathered in formation, waiting for the final deployment orders. The admirals were confident, the soldiers eager. Humanity had faced extinction before. Rogue AIs, bioweapon outbreaks, the siege of Europa. This was just another war. They were wrong. The first sign wasn't an attack. It was silence. Thousands of signals filled the fleet's command network, voices chattering, orders passing through encrypted channels, until all at once it stopped. No interference. No static. Just nothing. Then the lights flickered. Rourke stood on the Valor's bridge, gripping the rail as the deck shuddered beneath his feet. Alarms blared. Officers scrambled. But the instruments weren't failing. The power grid was stable. The ship was in perfect working order. And yet, the darkness at the edges of the viewport seemed deeper than it had any right to be. A technician gasped. "Sir, we've lost external comms." No response from the fleet. Rourke's gut twisted. He turned to tactical. "Are the other ships still there?" The lieutenant hesitated. His hands hovered over the controls, uncertain. I don't know." "What do you mean you don't?" Then the first ship folded. Not an explosion. Not a weapon strike. The UTS Indomitable, a dreadnought the size of a city, crumpled. Its hull warped, twisted as if space itself had turned against it. The ship screamed, metal groaning, alarms wailing, thousands of voices crying out over open channels. Then it was gone, vanished, not destroyed, not wreckage, just erased. And the fleet broke. Some ships opened fire at nothing, their cannons lighting up the void in blind terror. Others tried to jump to FDL, but the moment their drives engaged, they simply disappeared. It wasn't an attack. It was worse. It was a culling. Rourke gritted his teeth. All hands. And then they were inside. The bridge dimmed, the light bending, twisting, shadows stretching impossibly long. Figures flickered at the edges of vision. Humanoid shapes, but wrong. Stretched, fractured. A whisper crawled into Rourke's mind, threading through his skull like cold fingers. You are already ours. Hale fired first. Her sidearm barked, the muzzle flash illuminating the impossible. The figure closest to her staggered back, but it didn't fall. It unraveled, spiraling into ribbons of black, before reforming just inches away. The crew panicked. Gunfire erupted. The bridge became a war zone, bullets tearing through consoles, sparks raining from shattered displays. But the things in the dark didn't fall. They fed. A crewman screamed as his body stretched, pulled apart like clay. Another collapsed, clutching his head as his eyes blackened, his voice rising in a twisted, layered chorus of voices that weren't his own. Rourke grabbed Hale's shoulder, shoving her toward the emergency bulkhead. We have to go. Something moved behind him. A shadow lunged, too fast to react. Cold fingers brushed his temple, and for a single, awful moment, he saw planets burning, cities reshaped into impossible spirals, armies breaking before they ever fired a shot, humanity folded, rewritten into something that was no longer human at all. And then the vision snapped. Hale dragged him backward, her eyes wild. Captain, move! The emergency door slammed shut behind them. The bridge was gone. So was the fleet. Only the Valor remained. Barely. The Valor fell through space, wounded, dying, but not yet dead. The ship had barely escaped Waypoint 6, its FDL drive forcing a blind jump to anywhere but there. Now, it drifted at the edge of the Sol system, its hull scorched, its crew broken. Rourke stood at the command console, hands braced against the flickering display. What remained of the fleet was gone, erased, but Earth still stood. Not for long. They're coming. His voice was raw, scraped hollow. Commander Hale ran a trembling hand through her sweat-matted hair. How do you know? He met her gaze. Because they always come. The Revenants didn't invade in the way humanity understood. There were no warships on the scanners, no dreadnoughts breaching planetary defenses. Instead, the sky darkened. Earth's orbital stations went silent. Luna's colonies stopped responding. And then, from the heart of the void, they stepped through. The sky above Earth fractured, splitting open like shattered glass. Shadows bled to the cracks, twisting, shifting, forming shapes that defied logic. They weren't ships. They weren't soldiers. They were corruption made manifest. The end of all things given form. The UTD's defense grid opened fire. Satellites and planetary cannons unleashed everything they had: railguns, plasma lances, nuclear payloads. The void swallowed it all. The first cities fell in silence. Not to fire, not to bombs, but to something worse. Reports came in from Tokyo, Berlin, New York. People disappeared. Streets that had been full of life became hollow echoes of themselves. Buildings stood unchanged yet wrong, their angles twisting when unobserved. The very concept of humanity was being rewritten, city by city, soul by soul, and Earth could do nothing to stop it. On the Valor, Rourke watched as the final battle began. The last remnants of the fleet, the last guns of humanity, opened fire against an enemy that did not bleed. He clenched his fists. We can't stop them, Hale whispered. Rourke didn't respond, because she was right. But maybe, just maybe, they could do something worse. He turned to the ship's failing AI core, its systems barely functional after their last encounter. What's left of our arsenal? A damaged voice crackled through the speakers. Weapons at 5% capacity. FDL unstable. Core integrity failing. Not enough to win, but maybe enough to end it. Rourke took a slow breath. Run a scan of their anomaly. Find me a weak point. There was silence. Then, singularity instability detected. Energy source uncontained. Structural vulnerability present. Rourke exhaled. There it was. The revenants weren't invincible. Their presence, their very existence here was unstable, held together by whatever had torn open the sky. If they could break that... We overload the core, he said. Hale's eyes widened. That'll kill us. Yes. He looked back to the viewport, to the world already slipping away. But it might take them with us. The crew, what was left of them, stood silent. Then, one by one, they nodded. Rourke turned back to the failing AI. Set course. Straight into the anomaly. The Valor surged forward, engines screaming, weapons firing their last desperate rounds. The darkness rushed to meet them, hungry, waiting. And then the ship's core detonated. A second sun erupted in the sky, a blinding tear of white-hot fury. The singularity collapsed, folding in on itself, taking the shadows with it. The sky healed. The whispers fell silent. And for the first time in weeks, the darkness was gone. Humanity had survived, but it would never be the same.